And I'll speak to attorneys. I can only say this: there was absolutely no collusion. Everybody knows it. Every committee. I've been in office now for 11 months. For 11 months, they've had this phony cloud over this administration, over our government, and it has hurt our government. It does hurt our government. It's a Democrat hoax. When they have no collusion, and nobody's found any collusion at any level, it seems unlikely that you'd even have an interview.
That's the president, obviously, during a bilateral news conference with the poor Norwegian prime minister. Now, this all comes amid multiple reports that his legal team is preparing for a possible, if not probable, interview request with the Russia investigators. Now, the Times describes how this would all work. Quote, Mr. Mueller will have three choices for questioning Mr. Trump: written questions, an interview with his investigators, or a subpoena to appear before a grand jury. When it comes to the menu of option A, B, or C, historically and in all likelihood, what has happened and what probably will happen here, do you think?
Well, I mean, historically, if we're talking about presidents, I think we've had sort of all of those things happen, right? Clinton was under oath.
Yep.
Reagan, there was written questions and answers. I don't think that Mueller is going to accept written questions and answers. I would be very, very surprised at that. I think part of the point of an interview, especially in this investigation where obstruction is sort of, at
These
the
were all
forefront.
negotiated, Mimi, like with the terms of the interview?
Yeah, and that's true in everyday cases as well, right? A prosecutor always has the power of subpoena, to subpoena someone to the grand jury. Trump's lawyers, as many defense lawyers, don't want their client to go to the grand jury and be alone in the grand jury under oath without his lawyers there. That's probably their worst nightmare. So what they do, like defense lawyers do all the time, is they say, all right, let's work something out. And, from a prosecutor's point of view, that's frankly favorable as well. You don't necessarily want to put someone in the grand jury where they can invoke their Fifth Amendment.
Could Trump say, no, we're not going to do it?
Well, no, not if he gets a subpoena. And so they have
even
that.
The president's not exempt from a subpoena?
No, as far as I understand the law, I don't know that exact question on him being subpoenaed to the grand jury has been ruled on before, but as I understand it, what's been ruled on is a subpoena for documents to President Nixon, and basically the court said you're not exempt from subpoena power, and this wouldn't be any different.
Doug, if I am the president's legal team, obviously I want to make sure my guy doesn't make a bad situation worse, but also the goal is closure here. It has been 11 months of his administration where in one shape or form, this has been a story that has either increased with interest here or certainly seriousness, and it shows no signs of going in the other direction. So the faster he can put this thing to bed, the better. So you're now his legal team. We saw the three options here. Does he have to worry about going under oath? Can he say a half-truth or a lie? Will he face the same kind of criminal exposure as you or I would if we were been subpoenaed here? Does it work differently for a president or not?
No, I think he's a person under oath. I mean, maybe you guys disagree, but I don't see any upside for him doing anything in this situation. As far as closure goes, I don't think he's being asked these questions for closure. I mean, he is the subject. I'm not saying the target, but he's the subject of what's going on. Anything he does there is possibly dangerous to him. And I think that's the advice he'll probably get. Is there anything that he can gain here, Mayo, or is this all just exposure for him?
If there is more to the allegations, if there's something that really they're not going to be able to evade.
If he was really kept out of the loop, hypothetically, and it was underlings or whatever else that had contact with the Russians here, he knew none of the details, and he was basically kept out of the loop intentionally or otherwise, and he testifies as such, does that now remove him as basically a person of interest?
If he's, well, possibly, but again, one of the things that's interesting is investigations have a life of their own, so he can go in. What he can't do is you can do that as an individual who gets charged. You can go in and take the fifth. As the President of the United States, you can't do that. I mean, you can, but if you do that, it's over. He has to contemplate who else that's close to him has exposure. And each day, they send people on Meet the Press and other shows, and they talk about, their viewpoint on this entire thing, and they contradict themselves, and they create new avenues of investigation. So that can always come back to him, and it doesn't have to end up with the source of the investigation. It can be wherever it leads, and if it leads to criminality anywhere else, it still could be grounds for him to be impeached.
So Dan, you're the president, or you're his legal team right now. You're walking in. Are you walking in blind? Do you know the scope of questions that Mueller and team will be asking you? Forget the form for a minute, because I think Mimi's right. You don't seem, at least Mueller's going to give you a pre-written list of questions and say, get it back to me at your earliest convenience. There's going to be something more substantive and deliberate. Do you know where it's coming from, or does he sit down and kind of walk us through the optics of how this thing could work?
Well, I think you need to make one very important distinction, which is the president is not his legal team, and they are two very different entities. And I think one of the very difficult things that his legal team has is controlling him. And part of the reason why I'm certain they want to keep him out of any interview if they can is that he seems to be uncontrollable if you take his tweets the best example. But to your question, is from a prosecutor's standpoint, we would never provide the questions, and we would almost never limit ourselves to specific questions or specific areas.
So it could run the gamut. I'm trying to understand this, not just related specifically to during the course of the campaign, any context with the Russians, but it could even go to financial dealings, when he was a private citizen with the Russians or whatever else. Can they go as far as they want to field, or is that negotiated before they sit down?
So where I was going with this, I think this is different. I do think this is going to be a different situation where they will likely negotiate topics of conversation, of interview questions. They will not, I highly doubt Mueller would ever agree to say, okay, I won't ask him X or I won't ask him Y, but they may say he will answer questions about Russia, about the campaign. He is not going to answer questions about the Trump organization finances.
So he
or
can just
other
refuse to
things.
answer questions?
He can, but he runs the risk then of being subpoenaed. Yeah. And then having to make the choice of going to the grand jury or taking the fifth, which I agree with Mayo, he's not going to do. So there's a lot of cat and mouse here, but the one thing for sure is that if his lawyers can keep him out of Mueller's questioning, they will try desperately to do that.
But I don't think they can. I mean, because with the threat of the grand jury always there, don't they have to submit him to some kind of questioning so that to avoid the grand jury subpoena?
It depends on whether he's a target or not. If he's a target, you don't generally subpoena a target to a grand jury, and we don't. That's a term of art in prosecution land, but it means when you are very close to charging someone, you would not. It's almost like a trap to put them in the grand jury.
Well,
but we just don't know what the evidence is, and we don't know what.
A lot of the genesis of this people talk about is that Fusion GPS dossier, and it's become a political hot potato for all intents and purposes right now. To that end here, just yesterday, Senator Dianne Feinstein, ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, released the testimony from the co-founder of Fusion here. The entire document, not the excerpts that we'd be getting in dribs and drabs. Fusion, they hired a former British intelligence officer named Christopher Steele, there you can see him, to look into Trump's dealings with Russia. Now, the dossier that came out detailed sordid allegations about the president, Russian prostitutes, also spelled out shady financial deals between Trump and the Russians. By the way, it was never substantiated, but it's still part of this story. Republicans, they hired Fusion GPS during the GOP primary, but then when it got to the general, they stopped paying after he won the nomination. At that point, the Democrats picked up the tab, and the National Committee and Hillary Clinton's people then ponied up for more intel. Now, it is a political football, Republicans say. They say it's complete BS, and it's what started the entire Russia probe. Turns out that's not the case at all. Democrats say it raised serious questions about the president's ties to Russians and also makes him our target for blackmail, which, of course, is a dangerous proposition. 400 pages worth. I've gone through a lot of it. There's a lot of he said, she said, and also what's interesting, if you're Senator Grassley from the Republican side, you spend the entire time trying to discredit it. If you're Senator Feinstein, you're trying to see the genesis of this report and everything else and what they found. But it seems, unless I'm misreading this with naivete, that this guy, when he was brought on, comes across some potentially damning information. And he did what we, and even Steve Bannon, of all people, said that Donald Trump and friends should have done with that meeting in Trump Tower. They should have gone to the FBI with it, as Steele did, and said, listen, this could be blackmail against a potential president of the United States. Am I being naive in subtracting political motivations at that point? Because at that point, that's what it seemed to be.
Yeah, I mean, look, as far as I understand it, at that point, right? I mean, it's since become politicized,
Sure.
but at that point, Christopher Steele, who was a respected intelligence
With MI5, yep.
agent, you know, he didn't even know, as I understand it originally, like who Fusion GPS's client was. He didn't know that it had become the Democratic, you know, Hillary Clinton campaign. He was just given this mission to look for, you know, information on Trump. He discovered more than he could possibly imagine, and some of it, whether it turns out to be right or not, alarmed him. And so he did what we want citizens to do, what we want, you know, anyone to do. He at great risk to himself, I think, you know, went to the FBI, and so, you know, the fact that it's become this political hot potato, as you say, is sort of, it's a distraction. I mean, the Republicans tried to use it to say that the whole Mueller investigation is tainted, and that's just been discredited now at this point.
And to me, Doug, one of the things that seems to be clear coming out of this, and all of you guys have been prosecutors at different points of your lives, it's the money. At the end of the day, it's not what happened in the hotel room. It's the money. According to this report, one of the things that gave Steele real pause was all these trips to Russia. There was never a consummation of any financial deal. It made no sense with both the MO of both Trump and then also the principals involved. What's going on here? And if we can figure out the finances, maybe that'll help explain here what happened not only in the run-up to the election, but maybe even potentially before it.
Yeah, well, I think the finances are relevant to what the investigation that's going on. But as lawyers that go into courtrooms and try to prove things, it's very, very difficult to prove things without evidence, clear evidence. So it's interesting for everybody to talk about dossiers and these things that may have happened, may not have happened, but to actually prove things is very, very difficult. And that's something that people have. You can say whatever you want, but to prove it is a completely different thing.
The only thing, though, Doug, is that so far it certainly hasn't been dispositive that everything in the dossier is accurate, as you said earlier, Richard, but it's certainly not discredited either.
Nope.
So what it does is it gives prosecutors and investigators new avenues to go down. And just watching President Trump, you know, if you were to follow him before he was president, and he had even a less of a governor, I'm quite sure that there was a lot for them to look at. Now, whether it's criminal is an entirely different issue, but that could also explain the length of the investigation, because the investigation, a federal investigation like this is not a long period of time given what we're talking about.
I will say one thing that was said today, Dan, that bothered me at that joint presser that they had with the Norwegian premier, which was Trump at one point, first of all, made it sound like he was still running against Hillary. The election happened a year ago, but beside that, he said the GOP needs to get in control of the Mueller probe. Now, I don't care what anyone's politics are. I don't care who they voted for. I don't care what party they ascribe to. The idea that a sitting president is telling one political party for an independent probe that he is potentially a target of, you party, put the kibosh on this thing enough already, make it go away. In living Technicolor on live TV, you know, we grade on this impossibly low curve for what shocks us anymore, but that's amazing.
Well, his whole response to this investigation has been along those lines. And let's take a step back. If you're the president of this country and you have information, credible information, that another significant superpower country tried to infiltrate our government and our democratic process, is there any other more serious national security risk than something like that? Of course, the president should be very worried about it and want to ferret out what exactly happened and get to the bottom of it. So it turns it on its head because, of course, he's being or there are some allegations that he masterminded it or was involved in it or colluded with the Russians in doing it. So he's going into his defensive mechanism. And I think that's what this whole Fusion GPS thing is. At the end of the day, to your point, Richard, about the documents and the bank records, Mueller has Trump's tax returns. Mueller has Trump's bank records, the Trump organization, and everything that he's doing. No one else has seen that. And that is going to ultimately provide the pathways that they're going to go to see whether there was collusion.
And do
or not.
we, the people, at the end of this, do we get to have the transcript of the questions from, whether it's direct questions, written questions, grand jury questions? Do we get to hear the conversations? Will we ever learn about what was asked of the president and his responses?
I think there will, if there's not a criminal case, there will be a very lengthy report. A lot of that, I'm sure, will be classified and redacted when it comes out, and will be subject to litigation and Freedom of the Information Act to get it unredacted. But I would be shocked if Mueller, at the end of the day, did not produce an extensive report documenting, itemizing, explaining the process. Because, to your point, the public needs to know that.
Absolutely.
and will know that.
2025, 2225, the American people know what's in there.
Don't get me started with the grassy knoll. Okay, coming up next, the battle over body cams. NYPD officers now, they've got cameras, but the largest police union, they want to limit the release when it comes to the videos. Does the public have the right to see all the footage or not? Stay with us.